Hey there, interwebs.
3.141592653884622638463383795028841971693993751
Alright, enough beating around the bush, no pun intended. Would flails be a good choice for a peasant's revolt? Well, it's cheap and easy to produce, and most peasants would already have access to one and familiarity with it, but it's also sufficiently outside the battlefield norm that most noblemen and professional soldiers would probably struggle to defend against it in ways that they wouldn't have against spears and clubs, so it's got some major upshots. The downside is that its defense kind of sucks, and its versatility is even worse. So is it a good peasant's weapon? Yes. Would I equip every soldier with it in my hypothetical peasant's revolt? Hell no. In order to get maximum offensive utility out of flails, I feel that they would have to be distributed amongst people with other weapons, such as spears, gooden discs, and bows, in a primitive sort of combined arms strategy. But who would ever expect peasants to know how to work together as a team? If you're a regular to this series, you already know that I love the flag of Maryland, so it should come as no surprise that it inspired the overall layout of my design. I included Jolly Rogers due to my interest in piracy, but the Albanian flag has no real reason to be a part of this design. So while this flag is related to several others, that's again more due to rule of cool and not some deeper connection. Fail. Using my grading rubric, where every flag starts out with an A and drops one letter grade for each rule that it breaks, this design barely manages to squeak by with a D. Maybe I'm biased, but since the first two parameters could go either way, I'm going to bump it up to a D+. Now, can I do any better? Of course I can. I already designed myself a new flag when I was in college, and it's the one which I show at the start of every flag-shaming video. You see, I went a little manic researching this episode, but I believe that through my fervor, I may have solved a mystery stretching back roughly 300 years. Namely, whose flag is this, really, and why do we misattribute it to Blackbeard? Let's start by going back 4 paragraphs. I told you that Blackbeard was the wrong answer to my question, who flew this flag, but any of the other 4 might have been correct. In 1723, Captain Charles Harris and his 25 crew members were hanged for piracy, and their flag was on display with their bodies. The contemporary newspaper, the New England Courant, reported its appearance as follows. Their black flag, with a portraiture of death having an hourglass in one hand and a dart in the other, at the end of which was the form of a heart with 3 drops of blood falling from it, was affixed at one corner of the gallows. This flag they called Old Roger, and often used to say that they would live and die under it. Johnson's General History states that they used a deep blue flag which had portrayed on the middle of it an anatomy with an hourglass in one hand and a dart in the heart with 3 drops of blood proceeding from it in the other. These descriptions of Harris's flag sound an awful lot like Blackbeard's supposed flag, minus the crown, and I find the fact that the two accounts are so similar but not quite the same to be more reassuring than if they matched word for word. The slight discrepancy leads me to believe that one was less likely to be simply regurgitating the report of the other, but the similarity of the details lends credibility to both, and to Johnson's General History as a whole. Naval historian Bennerson Little speculated that perhaps Harris wanted to be different or simply didn't have any black fabric to use, or maybe the once black flag had faded to a deep blue, which would also explain the nickname Old Roger instead of Jolly Roger. Johnson's General History also tells us that, a day or 2 after they parted, Spriggs was chosen captain by the rest, and a black ensign was made, which they called Jolly Roger, with the same device that Captain Lowe carried, viz. A white skeleton in the middle of it, with a dart in one hand striking a bleeding heart, and in the other an hourglass. Again, we have a flag of the general Blackbeard style, this time being attributed to Francis Spriggs, circa 1724 or 5. It also indirectly tells us that the flag of that design was used by Ned Lowe, who worked in piratical association with Charles Harris. That same year, the Boston Newsletter described the Jolly Roger of John Phillips as a dark flag, in the middle of which an anatomy, and at one side of it a dart in the heart, with drops of blood proceeding from it, and on the other side an hourglass. This artist's interpretation was furnished through Wikimedia, but the paper's description could also match the designs of Harris, Spriggs, and Lowe, which I believe was more likely to have been the case. This design has been attributed to John Quelch in recent years, and popular myth claims that it was known as Old Roger, and therefore the origin of the term Jolly Roger, but all of that seems to have been invented by the 20th century journalist Ralph Delahaye Payne. None of the testimony from Quelch's 1704 trial makes reference to any sort of Jolly Roger, and his crew asserted that the flag of England had been flown at all times. Quelch aside, that's still 4 notable pirates whose flags fit the skeleton with an hourglass and a dart stabbing a heart motif, and it seems to have been one of the more popular shared designs for historical Jolly Rogers. Modern sources make the baseless claim that Lowe et al. Adopted the design from Blackbeard, who had died roughly 5 years prior, but according to E.T. Fox, the design was likely first connected to Blackbeard by Douglas Botting in his 1978 book, The Pirates, and he probably took it from this sketch in the 1912 edition of The Mariner's Mirror. The accompanying text read as follows. In the Book of Buried Treasure, R.D. Payne, 1911, is to be found the following. A flag was hoisted, called Old Roger, described as having in the middle of it an anatomy, skeleton, with an hourglass in one hand, and a dart in the heart with 3 drops of blood proceeding from it in the other. This description is from a quotation from an account of John Quelch, a pirate executed at Boston in 1704. There is a photographic reproduction of a watercolor drawing of this pattern of flag, which is in the Bibliothèque Nationale, Paris, in Armée et Marine, 1900, of which the enclosed sketch is a copy. That quote takes a little effort to unpack, but I want you to note the 2 names mentioned, R.D. Payne and John Quelch. Basically, the caption is explaining that this is a sketch of a photograph of a watercolor, and the description comes from Payne's account of the execution of John Quelch. But if Quelch's use of the flag was made up by Ralph Payne, where did he get the idea? I believe that, as a man obviously intrigued by pirates, Payne may have read Johnson's general history and lifted the design from there. Putting it all together, we end up with a timeline which looks something like this. Blackbeard was active from 1716 to 1718. Edward Lowe and others flew this flag in the early 1720s, and descriptions survived in period newspapers and Charles Johnson's A General History of Pirates. Ralph Delahaye Payne probably read one or more of these accounts and wrongly attributed the design to John Quelch in 1911, and a sketch based on a watercolor depiction of it was published in the Mariner's Mirror in 1912, leading Douglas Botting to connect the design to Blackbeard in 1978, 260 years after the pirate's death. Since then, people have assumed that Edward Lowe's flag was based on Blackbeard's, but it was probably the other way around. The flag commonly attributed to Blackbeard is actually based on Edward Lowe's. The design only made its way to Blackbeard in what is essentially a 3-century-long vexillological game of Whisper Down the Lane. To be perfectly honest, I've got nothing against any of these designs. You may even recall that all the way back in episode 0, I used the classic Death's Head Jolly Roger as an example of a flag that is simple enough to be recognizable, even if the layperson can't draw a skull from memory. My favorite Death's Head variant by a nautical mile, however, is the one associated with Calico Jack Rackham. It's a shame that this one seems to have been made up and falsely attributed to him in 1959, because the design is fantastic. It's bold and relatively simple, with no writing, 2 stark colors, and a double dose of symbolism. The skull clearly represents death and mortality, and anecdotally, the crossed swords represent Calico Jack's 2 ladies, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who are also my favorite pirate couple. Yes, I said couple, but whether they were lovers or just gals being pals is up to interpretation. Happy Pride Month, by the way. The swords may not be quite as iconic as a pair of crossbones, but they're recognizably unique. A white skull and crossbones on a plain black field could be the flag of any one of half a dozen pirates, or it could represent generic danger, death, or poison, although that last one is gradually being supplanted by Mr. Yuck. Meanwhile, a skull over crossed swords evokes the Death's Head motif, but also still inarguably communicates piracy. Hell, if you just do a Google image search for a pirate flag, about half of the results will use a pair of crossed swords instead of bones. Now that is what I call an iconic look, and I'd expect nothing less from the man who got nicknamed for his fashion sense. #aesthetic. The idea of barbarian warriors getting named after the pelts they wear also applies to the Northmen themselves, specifically the Berserkers. Although the terms barbarian and berserker are sometimes used interchangeably, looking at you, Dungeons & Dragons, the word berserker actually means bear shirt in Old Norse. That being said, the word bear doesn't actually mean bear. Well, okay, it does now, but it didn't start out that way. Bear with me for a moment. Do you know what indigenous North Americans, Celts, Finns, and Ainu people of northern Japan all had in common? If you said arctolatry or bear worship, good guess because you're right. As a matter of fact, just about any place where bears can be found has also known at least one culture which revered the creatures at some point in its history. Some scholars even speculate that Neanderthals of the Paleolithic era revered the cave bear, although that hypothesis is now considered dubious. That puts the bear on the same deific playing field as big concepts like fertility, the sun, and death. Now that is power. Perhaps now you see why, back in the days of yore, the bear was considered so powerful and fearsome that no one dared to speak its true name, lest they unintentionally summon it Beetlejuice style. As an alternative, euphemistic titles or kennings were often employed instead, including the Proto-Germanic word bero, functionally meaning the brown one. Based on reconstructed Indo-European, the real word should probably be something like Yeah, in my household, it is established lore that we do not speak the true name of the bear. As a result of this terminological taboo, many of Proto-Germanic's linguistic descendants refer to the creature with similar words, such as the English bear, or slightly archaic bruin, the German bear, and the Icelandic bjorn, which is close to the Old English beorn. Yes, like the character from The Hobbit. Old English also employed the kenning Beowulf, literally meaning bee-wolf, although in this case wolf is a poetic way of saying hunter, due to the bear's well-documented love of honey. The name game doesn't stop at bear, either. These creatures are a perfect example of what happens when zoological kennings take a turn on the euphemism treadmill. Similar to the Old English bee hunter is the Slavic word medved, meaning honey eater, which itself replaced a word akin to bear, preserved in words like berloga, literally bear's lair, referring to a den. This means that the Slavs went from the bear's true name to bear to honey eater, which is now giving way to terms like the furry one. Panda's actual connection to cats all has to do with their eyes. The general rule of thumb for eyes, as mentioned before on this series, is round pupil equals omnivore or large predator, e.g. humans, wolves, lions, eagles, griffins, etc. Horizontal pupil equals prey herbivore, e.g. horses, sheep, non-minotaur bovines. And vertical pupil equals predatory carnivore, e.g. cats, foxes, and snakes. And try not to stick your thumb in your eye. Based on this, you'd expect bears to have round pupils, given that they're large, occasionally predatory omnivores, and you'd be right. Except for pandas. They have slit pupils, and given that they basically eat nothing but grass, you might expect these to be horizontal slits. But you'd be wrong. For some reason, pandas, both the giant and red varieties, have the eyes of a cat or a snake, low-to-the-ground predators. And so do koalas. Why do pandas and koalas both have this predatory feature? They eat sticks and leaves. That last sentence wasn't just for emphasis, it was part of the answer, but let's take a step back. Wolves actually lick the insides of each other's mouths as a show of submission and respect, and to strengthen social bonds. That being said, the urine of the maned wolf, which despite its name is not closely related to wolves, does contain a chemical cocktail which smells so strongly of skunky marijuana that it once got the cops called on the Rotterdam Zoo to investigate reports of the suspicious odor. The urine of the binturong, or bearcat, meanwhile, contains 2-acetyl-1-pyrroline, a chemical enzyme that smells uncannily like hot buttered popcorn, and the beaver's anal glands produce a substance known as castoreum, which contains the same chemical esters as raspberry flavoring. Being aggregate fruits, neither strawberries nor blackberries are, botanically speaking, berries, and slowberries aren't either, but you know what are? Bananas. So are watermelons, pumpkins, eggplants, and, wouldn't you know it, tomatoes. You hopefully now see that identifying what is and isn't technically a fruit can be rather deceptive, and it gets even trickier for vegetables. This is because vegetables don't exist. Now, I don't mean to say that Brussels sprouts, for example, are some sort of mass delusion or government conspiracy, although I kind of wish they were. I mean that, like fish and reptiles, vegetables are a paraphyletic grouping, as the taxonomists would say. In layperson's terms, this means that there is no group of organisms, or parts thereof, which includes all traditional vegetables and nothing else. For example, what do carrots, asparagus, spinach, broccoli, and cucumbers have in common? They're all vegetables, but that's pretty much it. A carrot is a root, while asparagus is the stalk. Spinach is leaves, and broccoli florets are flowers, and cucumbers, much like the ever-controversial tomato, are technically another fruit. Original fact. Many animals have seemingly unnecessary descriptors in their names, like the duck-billed platypus, naked mole rat, and koala bear, but these once served to distinguish them from now extinct relatives, such as the hog-nosed platypus, hairy mole rat, and koala lion. Actual fact. Although there is no such thing as a hog-nosed platypus, hairy mole rat, or koala lion, there really are other species of mole rats, including the blind mole rat, silvery mole rat, and Somali striped mole rat, and the name of the extinct genus Thylacoleo means marsupial lion. Original fact. The binomial designation for clowns is Erythrhynchus platypus, or red-nosed flatfoot, not to be confused with the duck-billed platypus. These were formerly known as Homo platypus, flat-footed man, until a 2021 analysis of their mitochondrial DNA placed them within their own genus. Actual fact. Platypuses belong to the monospecific genus Ornithorhynchus, meaning bird snout. George Shaw attempted to name the species Platypus anatinus in 1799, but the generic name platypus was already taken by a taxon of ambrosia beetles 6 years prior. Additionally, the specific name of mallards is Platyrhynchus, or flat snout. This means that the latter portion of the duck-billed platypus's name means flatfoot, while the former portion refers by proxy to a flat face. The epitome of nonsense biology amongst fearsome critters, however, is, in my opinion, the side-hill gouger. The legs on one side of this critter are shorter than those on the other as a physiological adaptation for life on steep hillsides. I've heard that one can be subdued by sneaking up on it from behind and calling its name. When it turns around to face you, the short legs are now on the downhill side, causing it to fall over. If one were to find itself caught on level ground somehow, it would be doomed to permanently walk in circles, although a pair of gougers are said to have migrated west from New England by leaning on one another like two drunken buddies stumbling home from the pub. An amphisbaenian gouger could presumably move both forward and backward with equal ease. In case you're wondering how realistic gouger physiology is, I will say that limb asymmetry is uncommon in nature, but not unheard of. Crustaceans, including fiddler crabs, hermit crabs, clawed lobsters, and pistol shrimp, all have imbalanced front claws. Additionally, hermit crabs also have asymmetrical bodies to better fit the snail shells in which they live, and for which their larger claw acts as a door. The real-life animals, which I believe are most like the clockwise or counterclockwise traveling side-hill gougers, however, are the scale-eating fish of the species Parasotus microlepus, whose left or right-facing jaws are asymmetrically adapted for life on one specific side of whatever fish they're currently parasitizing. The morning sun blazed red over Vopnafjörður Bay, and Gus Gustafsson's head was swimming. Blood pounded in his ears like the waves beating the nearby shore, and an icy shudder passed through his body, for his clothes were soaked with dew where he lay upon the sod. What was he doing here, he wondered. As he rose unsteadily to his feet, he fought to recall what had occurred the night before. He knew he had been out for his evening stroll along the beach when he saw something fall from the sky, and it struck a hilltop only a few hundred meters distant. When he then ventured inland to investigate, he had discovered a fresh crater, but the object resting at its center was unlike any meteorite he had ever seen. The strange thing was crystalline in structure, but followed an unearthly geometry, and it glowed in a color he couldn't identify, as though light were refracting through impossible angles. Gus knew not what this queer thing was, nor how it could be, but its extraordinary nature seemed to beckon to him like a siren. He could only watch, mesmerized in horror, as his arm reached out to touch the scintillant quasi-crystal. A blinding flash followed, then darkness, and now here he was, still atop the hill overlooking the bay, but the crater was nowhere to be seen. Where had it gone? Was it ever there in the first place? He reeled and clasped a hand to his aching temple as the memory kept repeating itself in his mind. It was incredibly detailed, but impossibly strange. What had happened? Had it happened? Had it all been some bizarre dream? He cast a bleary eye around, searching his surroundings for any evidence to the contrary. When he found none, another shudder passed through him, but this one was brought about not by the morning chill. This one was born of fear. Staring up at the dentist, I saw that he was a small, thin man with more than a slightly insectoid nature about him. A pair of Coke bottle glasses made his buggy green eyes look even larger than they already were, and he made a nasally buzzing sound as he hummed to himself. He also moved with an unusual beetling gait in which each limb moved one joint at a time, as though he were too aware of his own limbs. I couldn't tell if the sickly artificial mint aroma belonged to him or the room, but it might have been both. No part of the situation put me at ease, but I was willing to overlook it all if the little man could free me from the demon-tooth's bony clutches. The minutes crept by as he lay siege to my mouth, battling the gnarled mass of recalcitrant calcium, armed with all manner of horrific metal implements. The harsh, flickering light of the fluorescent tubes overhead gave each one a sinister gleam. None would have looked out of place alongside instruments of torture in a medieval history museum. First, the strident mechanical shriek of the drill filled the cramped room as he bored through the base of the tooth and into the roots with its coarse bit. Next, he poked, prodded, and pried with an array of twisted hooks. Although I'd been given local anesthetic, I could still feel his tools in my mouth the same way that a gloved hand knows the shape of the object it holds. My eyes began to water as he dug their sharply pointed tips into the moist recess he'd created, yet despite all the pushing and pulling and pain, the tooth refused to budge. In Egypt's sandy silence, all alone stands a gigantic leg, which far off throws the only shadow that the desert knows. I am great Ozymandias, saith the stone, the king of kings. This mighty city shows the wonders of my hand. The city's gone, naught but the leg remaining to disclose the site of this forgotten Babylon. We wonder, and some hunter may express wonder like ours, when through the wilderness where London stood, holding the wolf in chase, he meets some fragment huge and stops to guess what powerful but unrecorded race once dwelt in that annihilated place. For those of you in the cheap seats, this means that Polidori took a dude's unfinished work, based his own short story on it, and changed the name of the main character to be the same as an insulting caricature of the story's original author, in a contest with said author. Frankenstein clearly took the gold in that contest, but Polidori still walked away with the silver and 2 massive brass balls. We can clearly see that sooner is better, as anyone could reasonably predict, but between half sold and the last 299, the odds don't change. Do with this information what you will, and support your local scout troop if you can. That's all from me for today, now that I've finally set the record straight. Thanks for watching, happy holidays, and as always, Capra delenda est.